All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and the vice president of policy for America's Society and Council of the Americas. Thank you for joining us. The Black Lives Matter protests in the United States have refocused attention on issues of racial injustice and inequality all over the world, including in Latin America. We've gathered here today with two great panelists to discuss the reverberations from these protests in Brazil, Colombia, and all over the region, and to also talk about similar movements under the umbrella, sometimes of Vidas Negras Importan, about movements in favor of greater equality that have a long history of their own. We're especially honored to host this event. At America's Quarterly, these issues are not new to us. We're proud to say that we've given frequent coverage years to issues of racial injustice, as well as Afro-descendant populations all over Latin America. But I think it's also fair to say that over the last few weeks and months, we've all been listening very carefully and trying to learn. And I certainly approach today's event with the limited perspective of a white American male. And so I hope that our panelists will help keep me honest, as well as focus today's conversation in the most productive way possible. We have two great panelists. Aurora Vergara-Figueroa is the director of the Afrodiasporic Studies Center at Icesi University. Her main research is on the sociological study of Afro-Colombians in the Colombian Pacific Coast, as well as the Afrodiasporic feminist movement in Colombia. And Thiago de Souza Amparo is a professor at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, teaching courses on human rights, international law, diversity and discrimination policies, and law. He's also been a consultant for the IDB and OSF on the issue of racial and LGBT discrimination. Just a couple reminders before we get started. For those of you who are not speaking, please keep your mics on mute. Also, the panel is public and being live streamed on YouTube and Twitter. We will take some questions towards the end of the event. If you're joining us via WebEx, you can send the questions to Q&A moderator. And if you are on Twitter, you can tag either at ASCOA or the America's Quarterly tag as well. So Aurora, I'd like to start with you, just kind of a basic question here. I mean, as you've watched these protests unfold in the United States over the last 6 weeks or so, how have you felt watching these things as an Afro-Colombian, and how have they played out? What kind of attention have the protests received in Colombia?
Good afternoon, Brian. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to start off by thanking the team that put this event together. To all of you listening, watching, and participating, it is really important in these times that we can talk about what's happening. So I'm truly honored and humble to be here. So your first question is really important for me because when in Colombia when we started to share the videos of what was happening with George Floyd in the United States, memory of several deaths in the similar situation in Cali started to come back. And several organizations across the country, Afro-descendant movements, started to say that the same types of events, of violence events, are happening in Cali, in Cartagena, in Chocó, and Medellin. So it was really strong to see this event, and something started to happen about the main discussions that we had on the same issue, because one question was, why this particular event and not several others? And in different writing clubs and reading clubs and debate groups, the turning point was the recording of the event. The several movements starting in the 1970s, they have been saying and they have been denouncing this type of violence, of racialized violence in Colombia and across Latin America. So I felt very pressed to start discussing how to address this particular situation so that we can connect it to other calls for justice and to other calls for reparations and to address racial inequality in the Americas. So that's why I felt, and that was the first response that we had in my immediate network of scholars.
Let me just, before we go to Thiago, let me ask a follow-up. You mentioned video, and it has been so clearly the cause for so much of this conversation. Has policing in Colombia, have videos caused similar conversations there? Has there been anything like George Floyd in terms of an event that was caught on camera that was able to cause this kind of debate?
Yes, there has been several events of this kind. In Cali, for example, there is one organization, in the Casa Cultural El Chontaduro. I remember them circulating photos and posters and videos of police violence event in the first 3 months of 2019. In fact, they recorded more than 33 events of violence with really young Afro-descendant teenagers. However, there's one difference between this kind of videos and what we saw with the case in the United States is that the way in which racial relations are constructed in Colombia allow to this type of events to not necessarily be addressed as critically as we have done with the case of George Floyd. So the case of George Floyd served as a mirror to the several calls for justice that Afro-descendant movements have been putting out to these similar events. So I remember publishing a column and attending several interviews, requests, explaining that the case of Floyd was going to help us to bring to the national debate the several requests that organizations have been making in Chocó, in Valle, in Cauca, in Cartagena, across the country.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to come back to some of that, but let's go to Thiago. And Thiago, maybe you could talk a little bit about the impact that George Floyd and these protests had in Brazil. But I also, we all of us sort of spoke before this event, but I was also hoping that you could, based on one of our prior conversations, you could also help us make clear that these are movements and causes that long predate what was happening in the United States and have, root causes and kind of independent protagonists all their own. It's not just triggered by what we've seen here in the United States by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. First, thank you very much, Brian and Mariana, for the invitation, for everyone in America's Quarterly. And it's very nice to be with Aurora talking about these issues in Brazil and Colombia and the United States. So going directly to your question, Brian, I think that first of all, as you mentioned, there is a long history and a shared history of Black protests in Brazil. If you don't need to go all the way back, you could, but you don't need to go all the way back to the slavery times. But if you go only to the democratization, so if you go to the 70s, you have a very strong movement in the 70s, the Black movement in the 70s with the unified Black movement, as they used to call themselves. And also you have in the 80s a very strong movement. And more recently in the 2000s and the last years, we had a very strong movement, especially around police violence, which is a key issue for the Black community in Brazil. We have a protest happening in Brazil, several basically after each brutal death by police, similar to what Aurora was saying about with the instances being recorded and this galvanizing a big movement. And I think that so there is a shared history in that sense, but also I think the major impact of the U.S. protests in Brazil is the change of the priority, especially in the mainstream media and in the mainstream discussions about racism and police violence, because very solid documentation of the instance of violence and disproportionate impact on Black people of police violence. But I think what changed is because what is happening in the United States, it's very big, and because the U.S. plays a big role geopolitically in the region, but also in the imagination of people in Brazil. So I think that it changed the priority and put the question of racism to the top of the priority when you look at on TV and newspapers and so on.
So race is a complicated subject everywhere. But look, I regular followers of America's Quarterly will know that Brazil is kind of my main focus area. It's a country where I lived from 2010 to 2015. And, it's a place where when I lived there, when I tried to have conversations about race, about the obvious disparities that were in front of me, the classic line that you heard here, or at least heard back then, was, well, race isn't really an issue in Brazil. Right, that here it's about class. It's not about race. Now, Thiago, I'm sure you'd agree. We could probably spend like an hour and a half dissecting why that is, and I'm not sure that we have the ability to cover all of that ground today. My question, though, is has the conversation on that point shifted at all in the last couple months, whether because of what's happening in the United States or because of other things that have been happening in Brazil? Is there, like we've seen here in the US, where you've seen this, the numbers for people who agree with the statement Black Lives Matter has gone dramatically up in the last couple of months? Is there any sign of kind of a similar willingness to accept that there is an issue and to discuss that issue in the last couple of months? Do you see that?
Yes, I see the change. I will not say the change happened in the last weeks because of the US protests, but it happened especially with the mobilization, and there are a lot of documentation about that, the mobilization of Black youth, especially after the 90s and the period of democratization and after the Constitution. There are several movements trying to denounce that we don't live in the racial democracy. And the short answer to your question that could be long is basically to say that, well, race plays a key role in Brazil differently than the United States, but a key role. So in the United States, you have a history of a legally established segregation and this system also in South Africa. But in Brazil, we were very good at putting forward the idea of racial democracy, and combined with the idea that we are all mixed and we actually don't have a racial problem. So this was a official ideology, especially if you look at the documentation in the dictatorship. This was official ideology in the dictatorship, and combine this with the immigration policies towards whitening the population. So when you put these two things together, our celebration of race democracy was actually a myth, in the sense that when you look in any statistics in terms of social statistics, police violence, or any other statistics, you see the disparity in the racial lines. There is a complexity here because most of the time people are talking about how they are perceived according to their color and to their face structure and things like this, not necessarily to their ancestry. So not looking necessarily to their family history, which is different from the United States. But there is no better or worse races in that sense. Both are very brutal and a system of inequality. And to finish, there is one sentence that I was talking yesterday about this with some academics, and a person emphasized the racial democracy and why we are also racializing all the time the discussion. And my answer to that was, well, it's like that saying in Spanish, I don't believe in witches, but they exist. In the same way that you cannot believe in race, but if you look at any statistics on police violence, socioeconomic inequality, race lines are there, racial lines are there, racial disparities are there. So even if it's in a different system and ideology in the United States, but it's there.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to come back to the police violence and also some of those statistics. But first, I just want to go to Aurora for a quick comment on this. Aurora, I have to confess, I don't know kind of the zeitgeist around race in Colombia as well as I do in Brazil, but I saw you kind of smiling and nodding with what appeared to be something like recognition. Thiago was speaking. I mean, does a lot of what he said echo for you as far as public attitudes in Colombia?
Definitely. And the first thing that I have to say is that there is a widespread belief that in Colombia there was no legal segregation or there was not racism by law. So the first thing that I had to say that there was racism by law, legal segregation in Colombia, starting in the 1600s. You will have what we used to call, or the empire used to call, the black laws. And those black laws were established a very strong separation of groups in Colombia that lasts until today. And then in the 1920s, it's really interesting that we are just commemorating a century of very strong debate in Bogota, in which politicians were arguing that there was a race problem in Colombia, and that the way to erase the problem was absorbing. They used the argument that they used was absorbing the black blood and absorbing the indigenous blood. So that debate is pretty important for the political history in Colombia, because those who made the argument then went to be the ministers of education, the minister of health, and then the ministers of public relations, international relationships, and public, I think you say international affairs. And then they were really important to establish 2 denials of immigration in the 1920s, to everybody that was Afro-descendant, and then to the Japanese. So that past is extremely important, because when we talk about race in Colombia, most of the time, and when many people across the globe talk about Colombia, there is this idea that there was no segregation by law and that there is something like racial democracy, and there is no such thing. And it's important to recognize that so that we can understand today the implications of this segregation. You will find today that the main territories in which Afro-descendants live are the poorest of the nation, and they are impacted the most by main events of violence, and many issues that you can measure, such as life expectancy, is lower in those regions. So I definitely, I was nodding at Thiago's reflections, because to understand this context, we need to understand this historical conceptions of race in the country.
Well, that's right. And I, just to make a personal observation, one of the interesting things about getting a little bit older is that, I'm 42, and you realize, you talk about the 1920s, and that was 100 years ago. But as you sort of get older, you realize, 100 years is actually not that much time. It's a really weird thing to say, but it's basically 2 generations ago, right? My grandparents were that reality that you described is just not that long. And there was a really interesting photo that they showed here in the American press of, I believe, a young girl who was kept out of public schools, and I believe it was Alabama, and the observation was that young girl is now 65. So these issues, which we, I suppose some people had thought of as being in the past, they're not as far in the past as they sometimes see. I want to talk about economies and politics, but before we get there, so much of the reason why we're having this conversation, it is about police violence in general. And Thiago, back to your expression that you cited earlier, that the numbers are so important here. I want to take one metric, which is the death toll of police killings by police in Rio de Janeiro, where in the first 6 months of 2019, there were 1,075 of these people killed by police. 80% were Afro-Brazilian. Tell us a little bit about, that debate. It's obviously, it's become even more politicized in the era of President Jair Bolsonaro. We've had these protests in Brazil over the last couple of weeks as well, focusing on this issue. Can you describe the current reality for us, as well as kind of where you think things are headed?
So it's very important to bring out the numbers, as you mentioned. When you look at the last year, the first semester of last year, if you look at the numbers, as you mentioned, 80% of people being killed by police are Black. And if you look at the current number, or the total number of people killed by police last year in Rio de Janeiro is 1,800, which is, if you look at the United States, is around 1,000 in the whole country. So when you look at this level of violence, and it's really endemic level of violence in Brazil, especially if you look at in Rio and in São Paulo. First of all, we need to think that we need to bear in mind that one of the reasons why this happens is the type of the technology and the type of policing that we do. I read some articles written by people organizing the protests in the United States right now, and there's a brilliant article in the New York Times saying this very provocative one, saying, yes, we want to abolish the police. And then it's very provocative because one of the things that it says, which is really true, is saying that people don't really know what policemen, policewomen do, because we always think that they are providing security and they are there, but actually they are actually monitoring and policing minor offenses, or going to a very ostentatious war on drugs, and going up to the favelas and have these big police operations that cost a lot of money and bring virtually no results, concrete results in terms of security. So in Brazil, there's a techniques of police which is basically focused on a militarized police on the street, and with the influence of the war on drugs, sometimes very big, large operations, especially in Rio de Janeiro, that had a very high death toll. Recently, we had a kid, a 14-year-old, João Pedro, killed in Rio de Janeiro by the police, and his house was there were around 70 shots, gunshots by the police in his house. So you see that the level of police violence in those operations are completely nonsense. And right now, the chief, only in this case, just to give example, the chief police that is investigating the case and investigating the responsibility of the policeman was actually present at the very same police operation. So you see that the level of investigation is very difficult. So the first of all is in Brazil, we have a very bad way of doing policing, the policing techniques, which is not very far from the United States when you look at the ideologies of broken windows or the stop and frisk and other technologies of policing. And second, there is a very bad system of responsibility and accountability for the policeman, because the Ministério Público, the public prosecutor's office, is doing a very bad job at investigating what the police is doing and conducting such investigations. So when you combine these two things, it's very explosive combination that actually leads to this kind of a very bad and very lethal police operations, especially in Rio de Janeiro, with the war on drugs being very predominant there.
Well, and of course, while it's true that these issues with violent police behavior, which feels like a euphemism somehow as I say it, but these go back decades, if not centuries. It's been exacerbated by a president who has made comments to the effect of who doesn't kill is not a policeman, and sort of other.
Yeah, and I think that's important also, Brian. It's also very important to mention that with the Bolsonaro, there are two things that are happening right now. One is this rhetoric of praising the violence and praising the police actions and police violence, which resonates to a part of the policemen, not all the policemen, but it resonates to some of the policemen. And secondly, we had a very a long series of measures by the president himself on easing the restrictions on gun control, which and actually including regulations regarding the monitoring of those guns, which actually provides ammunition for the organized crimes and the police militias, because in Brazil we not only have the organized crimes as the bad guys, but also the bad guys are the police, the militias. So yeah.
So thank you. So Aurora, I want to also give you an opportunity to talk about police violence issues there in Colombia, but I also want to talk a little bit about kind of the subject of the day, which is COVID-19 and the pandemic. And Going all the way back, at least to the 1980s, there's been studies have found about a 7-year gap in life expectancy of Afro-Colombians compared to the rest of the population. We've seen statistics showing that these communities are more vulnerable right now to the pandemic itself. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Just to add to the line of thought that Thiago was presenting, there was a report by ILEX, a corporation that is working on helping us to understand racial profiling in Colombia. And I truly invite you to look for what ILEX is doing, because it's one of the best reports that we have so far on police violence and police profiling in Colombia and racial profiling in Colombia. They found, for example, there's one specific bus stop in Bogota in which an Afro-Colombian person has 1427 more probabilities to be ticketed than a non-Afro-Colombian person in the same place. They determined that the skin color is a determinant factor to be profiled by the police, and if you are darker, you have twice probabilities, 20.67 more probabilities to have an interaction with the police, either to be ticketed, to be restrained, or to be taken to a police facility. They also determine, for example, that if you are young, male, and are dressed as a hip hop singer, your probabilities to be ticketed increase. So this report was published last week, and it's a very important piece of research to understand and to recognize racial profiling in Colombia and the criteria that they use to enforce violence. They determine and they teach us, for example, the particularities of verbal violence, physical violence, and the several manifestations that it takes in Bogota. So just to add to that question, because many newspapers and journalists have been inquiring about the manifestations of police violence in Colombia, and so far many people say there is not such thing. So there you have the evidence, and I will invite everybody to look for their project and for the report. Besides that, yes, you're right. The last census, even though there has several issues to determine the life of Afro-descendants, because there was an issue asking the question. So a huge number of the Afro-descendant population vanished from the census. So what we do was we adjusted the information they produced to calculate life expectancy and to see what are the main needs that Afro-descendants have in the country compared to the rest of the population. And it's really important to understand the magnitude of the problem. Across the country, Afro-descendants have a less life expectancy. In Chocó, the northern area of Chocó, is very problematic to see that starting in the 1980s and all the way to the 2020, the life expectancy of Black males is lower than the whole population. And you should start questioning why it's taking so long for the governments to make sure that Afro-descendant males live more and that they can actually they don't die prematurely. And that's what we're seeing with the data, both in Chocó and Nariño, who are very strong cases to see what's happening there. So in terms of COVID, the pandemic is showing the historic vulnerabilities of the region, and now Afro-descendants are 1% above the rest of the population in every dimension that is critical to understand the pandemic. And you have to also see that one dimension of systematic racism is to not have the data in order. So it took close to 3 months for the Institute of Health to publish the information. So the first reports came out like 3 weeks ago. We have been insisting to get the information, and it was not possible until the last couple of weeks. So we have a really strong issue here. Afro-descendants are dying at a higher rate, and what we are seeing, what we're foreseeing is not positive because the main hospitals across the region do not have the infrastructure to answer to this pandemic. We have been receiving reports from mayors across the Pacific. Listen to this. They are leaving their municipalities, most of them, because they have strong, how do you say that, comorbidities?
Underlying conditions.
Underlying conditions. And they're leaving their municipalities because they need to take care of themselves in order to continue administering their municipalities. So there is one municipality in the southern Pacific, in Maguipayan. The mayor sent SOS yesterday saying that he had to leave the region to be taken so that he can have adequate healthcare in Cali or in Bogota. The same thing is happening across the Pacific. So we're looking at very difficult time for Afro-descendants. The hospital in Quito was closed weeks into the quarantine period because most of the health personnel had the disease. We just had one doctor who died last week, and he had not received his salary for 7 months. So most of the health personnel is working without pay. Most of them have COVID-19, and we are looking at a very difficult time for Afro-descendants across the region.
Yeah, that sounds awful. Well, look, we have questions coming in, and just a reminder to those of you who are here on WebEx, you can send your questions to either the group chat or to the moderator. Those of you who are following us through a variety of other platforms on Twitter and elsewhere, you can tag either at AFCOA or at Amparo Quarterly, which is the America's Quarterly sign. So one question comes regarding the role of the media. And the question basically is, can you talk about the role the press has played and should play in terms of building general awareness of these issues? And, what the questioner says, he says, some educated Brazilians told me that Brazil has never had the same sort of civil rights movement as the USA. Okay, so we had that conversation earlier. However, I've seen protests in the news. Basically, the question is, do you think that the media has played a constructive role? Do you think that they should cover this issue more explicitly? Maybe, Aurora, we can stay with you on this one. I mean, how is Colombian media, I guess at the national level, treated these issues lately?
Yeah, they have contributed a lot to the conversation of racism. So what's happened in the last couple of months, we had several journalists asking what are the manifestations or the particular ways in which we can see racism in Colombia. So that has been very important. We have seen an increased number of writers, Afro-descendant writers from the region, calling out for the nation to identify the main issues that Blacks and Afro-descendants are facing across the nation. What we need now, I think, that they can contribute to dismantle this narrative that the movements in Brazil and in Colombia are like copying what's happening in the United States. I think they can do a better job, including in their narratives, the historical events that had happened in the previous decades. We just have 2 major strikes in 2017, 2018, led by Afro-descendants. So I think journalists can contribute to this growing argument, because I just saw a couple of news pieces and thinking pieces yesterday published that are really problematic, and for me, they need to be addressed pretty quickly so that we can add to the idea that there is a global movement that has a strong historical development, and not that we have movements in America, in Latin America, copying what's happening in the United States. Because just to present quick historical data or quick historical information, I think abolition of slavery in Colombia was in the 1851. And we have slavery since the 16th century all the way to the 19th century. And in the whole period, you see calls for justice, calls for reparation, calls for the redistribution that now you can see in the United States. Many cases that we have seen today have a strong foundation in the previous centuries. So the media can do a better job, including, as they have done with the debates on racism and the strong impact of COVID in Afrodescendant populations, by bringing this information, saying that these movements have been doing a tremendous job of calling the attention of the nations across the Americas to for racial equality, basically.
Of course, thank you for those comments. Of course, newsrooms are often frequently held back by the lack of diversity in their own newsrooms. And that's been an issue that we've seen involving outlets in the United States, where there's been a reckoning of sorts, everywhere from New York Times, Washington Post, national media. I mean, really what amounts to almost a rebellion within many reasons because of longstanding inability to address issues of diversity. And Thiago, when we look at Brazil, if I could just tell a very, very quick personal story. I worked during the 5 years that I lived in Sao Paulo. I worked there as a reporter, and I was there during the 2014 presidential elections. And I covered, a lot of things, but I was presidential politics was kind of the thing that I focused on the most. And one of the three main candidates in that election was Marina Silva, Afro-Brazilian. And at one point, there was polling fairly late in the race that showed that she was doing well overall, but actually struggling with Afro-Brazilians. She was down in the polls. And there was an interesting kind of political reason why that had to do with loyalties to the Workers' Party and kind of other dynamics of that election. I decided to write a story about it. I thought it was an interesting way to kind of cast a story. And I was massively criticized by my Brazilian colleagues in that newsroom because they said, you're an American who's trying to make this about race in a way that makes sense in your country, but makes no sense in ours. And of course, that newsroom was the Brazilians who were in that newsroom were almost entirely white. And, we ran the story and it got a good airing and caused some controversy within Brazil for the same reason. But it was instructive to me because it showed kind of the different ways that at least 6 years ago that people look at and talk about race. And at least with that group, kind of a hesitancy to look at it in a direct, honest way. Do you think that's changed at all? Do you see signs of that evolving, or do you still kind of see that same reluctance?
So I think there's ongoing conversation about the diversity in the media, especially mainstream media, and there are several discussions about that. So one example that is very striking example is one of the main news TV news in Brazil, Global News. They were covering the protests in the United States, and all the people commenting, they have these screens with share screens with 5 or 6 journalists commenting, and there was no one single black person commenting on the U.S. protest. And it was very interesting because on the screen it was written, the topic of the day is racism, which is very telling. And that they were very much criticized. And then afterwards, they had this historical event where they gather all the black people, all the black journalists that they had, and to do one show with them, which is a very important symbol. But in the same time, it shows the lack of diversity in the mainstream media in Brazil. There's one I give you one more general data besides this anecdote, is that when you look at the main newspapers in Brazil, and there was research recently by the University of the Rio de Janeiro showing that the Folha de São Paulo, Estadão, and Globo, the three main newspapers in the country, they have only 2% of Black people and 2% of Black men and 2% of Black women writing as economists for these newspapers. And some of them don't have any Black people writing on economics and politics. So it's very interesting to say that first of all, you have the lack of diversity in the mainstream media, especially people writing op-eds and so on. The second one is I think there is a movement of putting Black people only to talk about racism when it's convenient. So in Brazil, we celebrate the one of our national heroes, Zumbi dos Palmares, that fought against slavery in November. So in November, usually we have this saying that, well, we are going to be called to be on TV in November, so wait until then. And now there was even made a joke in the news saying that because of the US protests, we anticipated November to June. And this is very interesting, telling that one way to deal with the lack of diversity sometimes is to put them in a compartmentalized system. So the conversation is very hard in Brazil because sometimes we cannot have an in-depth conversation about racism across different topics. So I know many people that are very excellent political analysts, but because they are Black women or Black men, they are not called to write generally about politics and economics because there is this history of racism saying that, and Black feminists talk that a lot, saying that usually only white men are considered universal beings that can talk about any issue. And on the Black people, if I open my mouth, I'm going to talk about anything in a racialized way. So that's a discussion that we have. And about the candidacy and the politics, one issue that is very much in discussion now is how much the political parties, including progressive political parties, are actually investing money and resources and time on candidacies of Black people. And even when they have a large number of Black people being candidate, but they don't have the same amount of investment on those candidacies, and there's research showing that. So I think that we need to go beyond the conversation on racism that only talks about racism after a big event like George Floyd or in 1 month of the year. And mainstream this conversation in any kind of issue. And Aurora was talking about COVID-19. People were completely lost about the racial disparities in the COVID-19 because they could not see the race aspect in it because they can only mentalize and think about racism as an individualized, intentional act. So I think that's a very conversation that we need to move forward, and we are not very far from that.
Aurora, did you want to react to that at all?
Yes, definitely. The panel that you described happens, the same thing happened in Colombia. It was they replicated the model and they later apologized for it. But the comment sections are really interesting to do digital ethnographic studies when you pose the question of racism in Colombia, because several leaders received death threats in Colombia for just saying that there is racism in the country. For example, Goyo, she is one of the main Afro-Colombian singers, and she received several death threats because she used her music platform to say that there is racism and that we need to address it. She was very vocal about the death of Anderson Arboleda, a young Black male that was killed also by the police in Puerto Tejada, Cauca. And when she led the movement, or she led the initiatives to make visible his case, the reaction of several of her fans, was that they were going to leave her, and that they were several of them were very creative and very vocal in the ways in which they imagine someone should kill her. And that case is very important for us to understand. what we're facing now in the country. And as we move on the production of the information that's going to help to understand ways in which COVID-19 is impacting Afro-descendants, I think that what we're living now, what we are experiencing now, the reaction of the media, the reaction of the general public to the arguments supported by data, in which we're saying there is racism, there is a manifestation of a racialized society, there is systematic racism. I think this is going to be very informative for what comes next, because now we are determining and we are proving that Afro-descendants are being impacted the most in the rural areas by every aspect of this pandemic. And then we'll have to get ready to respond to every aspect of it. So far, the main argument is a political argument saying that it will not matter what is done because the politicians are corrupt. That's one of the arguments. And we'll see what we go from there, because that can hide the negligence as a form of racism of many functionaries that are in charge of answering to this pandemic. And the second argument is that Afro-descendants are just too happy and that they enjoy dancing and that they can stop partying and that they will just spread the virus. So that's happening so far. I think we'll have to do a very strong argument against that. We have some journalists and scholars publishing reflections on that. So we'll see what happens next.
Well, so let's go from there to kind of the final part of this conversation and to kind of synthesize some of the questions that have come in. They all sort of orbit around this idea of what's next, and specifically, what's it going to take to ensure that this issue doesn't just kind of fade from the national radar in the way that it has before. It seems like here in the United States, and I say this as kind of a perennial cynic and skeptic, it seems like here we've gone through something that's going to be lasting, and it may not go as far as some people want it to, but I personally believe that what's happened over the last 6 weeks or so really does mark an important before and after. What has to happen in your countries for this conversation that we're having right now to really have a lasting effect and a concrete effect with greater equality when it comes to economics, political representation, healthcare outcomes, vulnerability to violence, and all these categories that we've discussed today? Not sure who's Thiago, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so it's nice to finish in this sense of thinking forward. I think first of all, especially in this time of pandemics, the first priority is to make sure that people survive, because they cannot resist without surviving, and not surviving not only the pandemic but surviving the police operations. There is right now, this week, the Supreme Court in Brazil is discussing provisional measure restricting the police operations in Rio during the pandemics, because they are happening during the pandemic. And I didn't mention that, but it's rising even during the pandemic. In April, it increased 43% the number of killings of police in Rio in April. So first of all, it's guaranteeing the survival of people through economic measures because of the pandemic, and also because the police operations. Secondly, I think the conversation on race, it will change dramatically if we manage to mainstream, as I mentioned, race into all kind of discussions in the public debate. So economics, politics, and actually having more Black people talking about those issues in the public debate, either in the news, in the newspapers, in the TV, in the academia, in these spaces like this. So it's very important to have that. And third, and I think that democracy and the protection of the legal system and the rule of law that most of the white people and middle class people in our countries take for granted actually didn't arrive and didn't these measures, these protective measures, and these rule of law didn't actually arrive to the large population of Black people. Didn't reach this large number of people in Brazil, and I imagine in Colombia as well. So when we are discussing about not killing, not having this widespread killing, or having access to justice, or have access to legal counsel, things like this that are just ordinary, or being able to be represented in the politics, these are things that are taken for granted by most of the Black people, of white people in our countries, but actually did not reach yet the Black people in our countries. So I think that it's important to think of ways in which our institutions and the rule of law can actually reach the majority of our populations. So only if we have that, we will be able to change and build a larger and brighter future.
Thank you. And for the case of Colombia, I'll say that achieving racial equality in Colombia with a significant lasting effects will require that governments, corporations, international corporations, and several institutions listen to the calls for justice, reparation, and restitution, even the calls for redistribution of resources across the country and across the Americas. So what we're living here is connected to other movements in Brazil, in Costa Rica, and Mexico, in several countries across the globe. When I say listen, I truly mean to listen to the calls for justice, reparations, and redistribution, because it is very sad to see the governments ignore the calls for justice and the demands of the movements. Several movements have put together incredible plans to repair their communities, to transform their communities. And these plans only go to be hidden in desks or completely ignored. Organizations in Colombia, such as the Proceso de Comunidades Negras, PCN, they have called the government, they have sent letters, they had put together strategies, and the answer is yet to come. If we listen to their proposals, and if the governments, corporations, and institutions invest in long-term strategies, we can see a change. It is important to not only implement these ideas, but also consider the importance of time. In several occasions, we make a huge mistake when we work with organizations and communities, is that we invest in 3-month projects, 6-month projects, 12-month projects, and we're trying to overcome problems that took centuries to evolve. So we definitely need to put together projects that are in a long-term view, are long enough in order to see the change, in order for communities to have a life of dignity, and at the same time work towards the progress that we want to see in these territories.
Final question, and let's if we can keep the answers to just maybe like a minute each. It's the classic sort of final question, which is came from somebody in the room, which was, what can we do? What can ordinary people do from inside these countries, from the international community, to help advance this worthwhile goal of racial equality? Aurora, do you want to go first?
Okay. I just have one example that came from one of the projects that we led at CEAF, the Center for Afrodiasporic Studies. If you can work with a community for more than 1 year, for more than 2 years, if you can work with a community for a decade, sustain the project so that you can see the change, do it.
That was even shorter than 60 seconds. I'm not sure I can do any better. No, but I think there's just one thing that I always say that is important to mention is that racism is not only about an issue for Black people. Actually, racism is a system historically created by white people. So I think that it takes, acknowledge of the privilege that you have at your institutional level, personal level, business level, and try to use that to change the system's oppression. It can be helping solidarity networks that are building up during the pandemic. Can be, as Aurora said, invest in long-term change. Can be demand real to really listen to the Black people and to hear what they have to say to achieve justice. So I think that using the spaces that you have in order to achieve real change. So not only consider this an issue of others, but actually consider an issue for everyone.
Thiago and Aurora, I want to thank you both, not only for being so thoughtful, but for being so direct. Sometimes with these issues in front of an audience where you can't see the people in the audience, there's a tendency to sort of, handle things in an elliptical manner. And I don't think that's what we saw today. I think we covered a lot of ground. There were a lot of very specific ideas, a lot of truths were told. And so I thank you both for that. I want to thank our audience for joining us. And, just a confirmation from us here at America's Quarterly and ASCOA as well, that this is an issue that for us, we will not let disappear. It's important. It's part of creating a better world, and at least for me, and I know for many of my colleagues, that's a reason why we're here. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned, because this is a subject that we'll continue to write about in the pages of America's Quarterly, as well as at events like this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Have a wonderful day.
You too.